Yankees music's Mr. Worldwide.
Pitbull's such a household name that if you Google Pitbull, I come up before the dog.
How Pitbull came up from nothing and how he's helping others
is up next.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. I'm Mark Stein in for Tucker this evening. The Trump administration just unveiled its plan for a full-blown Space Force to be created by 2020. We'll have more on that just ahead, plus more on the alleged Islamic extremist compound in the New Mexico desert. But first, President Trump has highlighted his administration's efforts against the MS-13 gang. So, of course, the left now supports MS-13. Vox.com has published a video portraying the gang as a bunch of cute teenagers who ride bikes, listen to music, and work after-school jobs.
When you think of the street gang MS-13, what do you see? Maybe something like this. Or this. But what if I told you the typical MS-13 gang member in the US actually looks like one of these young men on Facebook?
The MS-13 members that I've been following are working after-school jobs, they're living with their parents, they get around Long Island on bicycles.
There's no indication that we're seeing a bigger surge of MS-13 than we'd seen in the past.
So basically, MS-13, they're like high school valedictorians with machetes. Timothy Sini is the district attorney of Suffolk County on Long Island and the county's former police commissioner, and he joins us. Tim, these guys are all over your neck of the woods. Are they just like kids doing after-school jobs, riding around on bicycles?
So here are the facts. In 2016 and part of 2017, we saw 17 homicides that MS-13 committed. That's 17 homicides in just 16 months. 2 of those homicides were Nisa Mickens and Kayla Cuevas, 15 and 16-year-old girls from Brentwood High School. Another homicide was a quadruple homicide where 4 boys were chopped into little pieces in a park in Central Islip. This is an extremely dangerous gang. I would submit probably one of the most dangerous street gangs that we have in the United States. Thanks to law enforcement's efforts, since that time period, we haven't seen a single confirmed MS-13 homicide, and that's because of the great work of the men and women of law enforcement in Suffolk County.
Now, you guys have a tough stomach for homicides, but even if you're familiar with finding dead bodies, what MS-13 do to their victims, where they actually chop off limbs and you find these guys dismembered and in pieces, these are some of the most vicious organized crime in the country, is it not?
That's exactly right. When they commit a murder, they do it to send a message. They're incredibly brutal. One example, as I already noted, was the four boys in Central Islip. There are plenty other examples. When the 2 girls were murdered in Brentwood, when we first came upon the homicide scene, the injuries were so severe, we actually thought it was a hit and run because the head trauma was so significant. We need to take this gang extremely seriously, and that's exactly what law enforcement is doing across the country. And I applaud everyone's efforts. We're working together to target violent MS-13 gang members, and we're making a difference.
Do you think it helps when someone like Vox.com, which has a lot of influence on the left, basically says, oh, sure, there's like some people who kill people in it, but there's a lot of just nice, cute kids there going along with it, as they might with any after-school activity?
No, it minimizes the threat that this street gang poses, and it minimizes the situation that these communities find themselves in. MS-13 targets young Hispanic boys in neighborhoods that are underserved. And it's incredibly important that we target these gang members with aggressive law enforcement tactics, and that we also invest in gang prevention.
Political football with Hispanics. In 2008, in 2009, President Obama said to my colleague from Univision, Jorge Ramos, we point out, and these are facts, this is not analysis, that in 1996, President Clinton signed something called the Immigration Reform Law, which gave, we do not want government in our lives, we fear God, and we love this country.
Let me just ask you a question on that, though, Elvira, because people can have different views on that. But what I find interesting about the Democrats' view of Hispanics and the media's, the media illegals, is that true that that's the only issue you guys care about?
No. It is very important for us to find a solution to those people that have lived here for more than 15, 20 years, like the TPS recipients.
Right.
We don't want those people to be thrown out of here like cattle because they have put roots in this country. That's why an immigration reform law is so important. It's important for us, but also the economy. Look what's happening with the economy right now. That is benefiting small Hispanic business.
That's certainly. President Trump's legal team is feuding with the Mueller investigation over the terms of a possible interview with the president. Last night on Hannity, Rudy Giuliani said the aggressiveness of the Mueller team would backfire on them.
Where's the sense of justice on the part of Mueller, on the part of the Justice Department? People who hate Trump were put into primary positions of power. That has completely tainted this investigation. The real story here is not that this case isn't going to fizzle. It's going to blow up on them.
Alan Dershowitz is a retired Harvard Law School professor and the author of The Case Against Impeaching Trump. And he joins us. Professor, is this interview with the president going to happen, and should it happen?
It won't happen. I think what's going to happen is Giuliani will make Mueller an offer he can't accept, to paraphrase The Godfather. And that way, Trump will be able to say, look, I wanted to testify, but it was Mueller who turned down a reasonable request by our attorney. Look, no lawyer would ever allow a client to testify under these circumstances. All they have to do is ask him one question. Did you know about the meeting in the Trump Tower with your son? If he answers that question truthfully, that he didn't know if that, in fact, is the truth, he could still be charged with perjury, lying to a government official, because we have Michael Cohen, who says he did know. And you never allow your client to say something that could be contradicted by another witness, because the prosecution can choose to believe that other witness.
If you had President Trump as a client, though, he's a very gregarious guy who is quite happy to sit down and talk and chit-chat to anybody, and thinks that as long as he's just like straightforward and says what he thinks, everything will be fine. Often from a lawyer's point of view, that's the worst kind of client to have, isn't it?
Yes, and I would certainly, I'm not his lawyer, obviously, but I would advise him to speak to the public on television, say what he wants to say, write his tweets, although I don't think he helps himself by some of his tweets, but under no circumstances put yourself in a position where you can be charged with perjury or lying to a federal official. And if he doesn't believe me, he should make 2 phone calls, one to Martha Stewart, who went to jail because of what she said to prosecutors, and the other to Bill Clinton, who was impeached because of what he said in an interview under oath. And so I think every responsible lawyer would say to him, you should not either testify or be interviewed. Look, I once gave him advice on television. I said, I have 4 pieces of advice. Don't fire, don't pardon, don't tweet, and don't testify.
I want to ask you about Rudy's other point, which is the hyper-partisan nature of what's been happening. And with reference to this Bruce Orr guy in the Justice Department and his 60 contacts, at least with Christopher Steele, the MI6 agent who was basically the dirty tricks operative for the Democrat Party. You know as well as I do that impartiality is the essence of justice. A county court judge can't have a bunch of communications with the plaintiff and not with the defendant. That's a big no-no. How come Bruce Orr at the Department of Justice doesn't know you can't talk to one political party continuously through the height of a campaign?
Of course, there's a difference between a judge and a prosecutor. Prosecutors are allowed to talk to people. Also, I don't believe that Mueller and his team care about whether the Democrats win or the Republicans win. They're not partisan in that sense. I think they are zealous, some would say overzealous prosecutors. Because he's special counsel, he has a target on the back of the president and others. If this case were handled by ordinary U.S. attorneys and they came back after a year or 2 years without indicting anybody, it wouldn't be a story. Nobody would know. But when a special counsel is given a target and he fails to indict, he's been a failure. And that's why I'm so strongly opposed to special counsel, except in the most extraordinary circumstances, which weren't met in this case.
You're absolutely right about that, Professor, in terms of the special counsel's office. I hope we get rid of them. Thanks a lot. As a young self-identified socialist, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supposedly represents the future of the Democrat Party. It's a strange future to behold.
We need to occupy every airport. We need to occupy every border. We need to occupy every ICE office. We look at these figures and we say, oh, unemployment is low. Everything is fine, right? Well, unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs. Why aren't we incorporating the cost of all the funeral expenses of those who die because they can't afford access to health care?
This like upper middle class is probably more moderate. But that upper middle class doesn't exist anymore. Their heyday was in the 90s when, like, you know, kids had like Furbies and like parents, you had like soccer moms with like 2 vans. That's not America anymore.
Soccer moms with 2 vans and funeral expenses crippling the economy. Is this the sort of thing the Democrats can run on, win on, and God help us govern on? Christy Setzer is the president of New Heights Communications, and she joins us. Is this the future of the party, Christy?
Well, look, I like Ocasio-Cortez. I think she speaks clearly. I think she speaks with moral conviction. And I think that a lot of people were inspired by her, and that's why she won her primary. That said, she won a primary a month ago in, you know, a congressional contest that represents the Bronx and Queens. This is not necessarily America. That said, I will say that people liked her because she is this young Latina woman who seemingly came out of nowhere. Nobody gave her a chance. She had no endorsements. Nobody in the party really got behind her. The New York Times never even wrote a piece about her until after she won, and then it was, where did this lady come from? But again, the reason that she did so well and was able to topple somebody like Joe Crowley is because of the way that she talked about issues that people cared about in her district.
No, but isn't it more basic than that? You said because she's a young Latina. Sure. And the Democrats now, it's all about identity politics. She's a young Latina. He's an old white male. He's the past. she's the future. And the fact that she talks about the 1990s like I talk about the 1890s, and that she seriously thinks that if 50% of the workforce are doing 2 jobs, you have full employment, that's irrelevant. It's all identity. Young Latina trumps dead white male.
No, I don't think so. But I do think that women in particular, and also people of color, are the ones who are furious right now. They are furious at Donald Trump. They are furious at I'll be honest, the old white men who are running the Republican Party right now, and frankly, who have a pretty big grip on the Democratic Party as well.
Yes.
And so that's why you see so many women across the country who have said, you know what, it's my turn. I'm going to run for office now, too.
Yeah.
And they are winning in record numbers. So particularly on the Democratic side, Mark, if you see a race in which there was not an incumbent, there was a man, a woman running, women on the Democratic side are winning 70% of the time. That is amazing. What that says is that America wants to see more women in office, and I support that.
Good luck telling that to Bernie and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, because you got your old white issues in that party too, Christy.
We sure do. It's a big tent.
And Nancy Pelosi is happy to take the tire iron to anyone who argues with her about that. What on earth was going on? Thank you, Christy. What on earth was going on in that New Mexico compound where Muslim extremists were allegedly performing exorcisms and training school shooters? Tucker Carlson Tonight investigates. That's next. It's a total horror show out in the New Mexico desert. According to authorities, 5 adults were holding 11 children at a private compound in appalling conditions and training at least one of those children to commit school shootings. What on earth was happening there, and could it have been exposed more quickly? Tucker Carlson tonight investigates. Ryan Mauro is director of the intelligence network at the Clarion Project, a non-profit that educates the public on radical Islam. He's assisted authorities in this investigation, and he joins us now. Ryan, if you watch certain other networks, you'll find it very hard to pick up on the Muslim angle to this. They're being rather coy about it, as is their wont. But the father of the principal guy here, for example, is a big-shot imam who was an unindicted co-conspirator in the original World Trade Center bombing a quarter century ago. So this has deep roots in the most extreme Islamic circles here in America.
Right, so what's really scary about this is that when someone from Al-Qaeda or ISIS gets arrested, you know they're almost certainly a fringe player. They're not a famous imam. Siraj Wahhaj is different. As soon as I started studying radical Islam, he was one of the first people on my radar because he's really one of the leaders of the Muslim American community, I'm sorry to say. And he's very radical, and the type of things that he has been connected to in terms of a coalition with other groups are the types of things that this group, this compound in New Mexico, were preparing to do, were learning how to do, that type of ideology. We haven't connected the imam to that specific operation in New Mexico, but you don't have to, because what you're talking about is the extremist infrastructure that does the hard work. The easy work is the violent part.
But in that sense, it seems more organized than some guy from Chechnya or wherever riding his car up onto the sidewalk and mowing down half a dozen people. In other words, that sort of freelance jihadism we've become used to. This seems something slightly more institutional.
That's right. So there's really two ways that you create this type of problem if you're a radical. First, you say, how do I create the person that holds the weapon? That's harder. And you do that by pushing the ideology. Imam Siraj Wahhaj, for example, in 2001, spoke at an event that was literally called Jihad Camp for Young Muslims. That's public.
Yeah, they're not shy about this, are they?
No, they've gotten a little bit better since 9/11.
Let me ask you something, because normally with school shootings, you'll see things on Twitter where, or the Las Vegas thing, for example, where there'll be a little bit of talk, oh, I'm sure this will be terrorist, his name will be Ahmed or whatever, and then it turns out to be the usual alienated loner. But things don't stay separate. So if school shootings are effective, at some point, jihadists will cotton onto that and want to get a piece of the action.
Well, look at how we all reacted to it, right? Even if you think it's a small number of casualties, it doesn't matter because it's a school shooting, and so they achieve the objective. And one of the ways that these groups operate above that ideological infrastructure in terms of operations is they set up security companies, and some of the information I have provided, I broke this story today, what I provide to the authorities does link people from that compound to a security company. That's how you get weapons. That's how you get law enforcement type training. That's how you do this type of thing.
And that's fascinating, Ryan, because when you look at that compound with those piled up rubber tires, there's nothing to it, bunch of stuff sitting out in the desert, but it's got important connections when it comes to getting the stuff they need. Thanks very much, Ryan. Tucker is going to come back after the break because Americans are an increasingly lonely people. How did that happen, and can it be fixed? That's coming up next. America is an increasingly crowded country with 325 million people concentrating more and more into a few major cities. Despite that, or maybe because of it, America is also becoming a lonelier country. People have fewer friends, fewer confidants, and feel less connected to their communities. And that's having a big effect on the nation. Vivek Murthy is a former Surgeon General of the United States, and Tucker recently spoke to him.
I'm not making an argument against psychiatric medication, obviously, but it's hard not to notice that the incidence of Americans, the number of Americans on psychiatric medication is rising, but so is the suicide rate. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that antidepressants have a role. They have a place when it comes to addressing depression, and there are a lot of folks who have benefited from them. But there's a big but here, which is that I think that we have been, over time, probably over-prescribing these medicines and not looking carefully for alternatives and for other ways to address people's depression, not really looking deeply at the causes of what's driving their depression.
Well, that's it right there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you'd think when the suicide rate spikes, and it has, measurably, that we would have a national conversation about why. What do you think the cause is?
Well, I don't think there's one single cause, but I think there's one particular cause that's contributing to depression that I don't think we talk about enough, and that is social disconnection, that is loneliness. And when I began my tenure as Surgeon General, if you had told me that I would be thinking about and talking about loneliness as much as I have, I would have told you you're absolutely wrong. But I was really educated by people all across America who I met during my travels while in office. And what I came to see through their stories and examples was that many of them were struggling with isolation and loneliness. They didn't always say that at the beginning of the conversation, but it became very clear that that was a part of their experience and their story, that it was contributing, in fact, to anxiety and to depression in their lives. When I delved more deeply into the science around loneliness, what became very clear is that loneliness is not just a bad feeling that we may have from time to time, but when it's experienced for long periods of time, it can increase our risk for heart disease, for dementia, for anxiety and depression, and it's associated with a shortening of our lifespan. So it turns out that people who are struggling with chronic loneliness not only live shorter lives, but the mortality impact is as great as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Well, sure. And there's no pleasure in it, of course. I mean, it's a living hell being lonely. So what were you prescribed to someone who's lonely? How do you fix that?
Well, the first thing that's important to address with someone who's struggling with loneliness is getting them to talk about it, to recognize that because you are lonely does not mean that you are broken or somehow fundamentally flawed.
Do you suspect that technology is making us lonelier?
I think that technology is a tool that can be used to both address loneliness but can also increase loneliness. What makes a difference is how you use technology. And I think the way that we're using technology right now, I worry, is actually increasing our loneliness. And it's doing so in a couple of ways. One, when you look at social media and you look at the data that's increasingly coming out on social media usage and its impact on the mental health of people, you see that increased social media usage is often associated with increased feelings of anxiety and depression. And what has happened, unfortunately, with social media is that many people have substituted their online relationships for their offline, in-person relationships. But there's another way in which technology is playing a role here, which is that all of us now walk around, or nearly all of us walk around with phones, with smartphones that give us immediate access to email, to text messaging. Now that can be incredibly convenient. I have a smartphone and I use it and it's very, very helpful. But that phone and our devices can also creep into other parts of our lives. Yeah. They can come to the dinner table with us and impact the quality of the conversations we have with our family. They can show up on the table at a restaurant when we're trying to catch up with a friend and instead end up being distracted by the messages that are popping up on our screen. So we have found that our phones and work more broadly has crept into our evenings, weekends, and vacation time, and that has actually taken away from our time with family and with close friends.
And you can see Tucker's full interview with the former Surgeon General on the Tucker Carlson Tonight Facebook page. Up next, it's final exam time. Can you do better than two Fox News pros at remembering this week's news? The contest, the battle, is coming up next. You know what that music means. It's time for Tucker's Final Exam, where we test Fox News professionals to see who is the news hero and who is the news zero. This week's contestants from Fox Business and from my hometown of Toronto too, Susan Lee. Susan was on Fox Business earlier today launching the new smartphone.
Samsung.
But is she smart without the phone? So few people are these days. And we also have with us Fox News correspondent at large, Geraldo Rivera.
Thank you.
He's done everything in show business except Tucker's Final Exam. And that was intentional. He planned it that way. But we've locked the doors so he can't get out. Okay, contestants, hands on buzzers.
Okay.
I'm going to ask the questions, and the first one to buzz gets to answer. But you must wait until I finish asking the question. You can answer once, and I'll acknowledge by saying your name, and each correct answer is worth 1 point. But you get it wrong, you lose a point. Best of 5 wins. Let's get started. Question 1. On Monday, which Hollywood Trump hater spent the night outside the White House singing Broadway show tunes in protest? Susan.
Rosie O'Donnell.
Let's roll that tape.
Yes.
The more people that show up here eventually will take over all of D.C. and it'll have no choice but to resign.
Yeah, actually, the president was, in fact, not in the White House, but in New Jersey. But he could still hear Rosie from there. A wild story out of Boise, Idaho. Folks there were shocked to look out of their windows and find more than 100 of what farm animal running loose through the city? And we go to Susan again.
Ducks.
Let's roll that tape.
Goats on the loose. Residents in Boise, Idaho, waking up to a shocking scene. 118 goats swarming their suburban yards, completely unsupervised.
So what happens if you get it wrong?
Oh, that's, yeah, we're back to 0-0. That's anyway, over 100 goats there. I believe they were fleeing Rosie's medley from Les Miserables. Let's go to question 3, and this is multiple choice. Oh. An Amish man in Michigan is giving ride-sharing apps a run for their money by launching his own business using just his horse and buggy. People in his town can secure a ride for just $5. What is this Amish entrepreneur calling the service? Is it A, Rent-A-Buggy, B, Ye Bearded Driver, or C, Amish Uber? And we go to Geraldo.
Amish Uber, C.
Let's roll that tape.
Meet the Amish guy in southern Michigan who's dubbed himself the Amish Uber.
Very good.
He drives folks around for $5 a pop in his horse and buggy. Doesn't have a cell phone, obviously, so you need to flag him down. And he isn't officially associated with Uber, but he gets people where they're going for an Abe Lincoln note.
Yeah, we could use that in New York. I hate it when you come out of a quilting bee and you're late for the barn raising and you can't find a yellow cab anywhere. So we really need that in New York. Question, that means that, by the way, Susan, Canada's reputation is now riding on this. Geraldo takes the lead, 1-0. Question 4. A man was arrested this past week after a video went viral of him harassing a very large animal in Yellowstone National Park. The man nearly got himself killed when the beast charged him. What type of animal was he harassing? Susan buzzed too early. She's being deported back to Toronto. ICE are outside of the studio right now. Geraldo, your turn to answer.
A bison.
Yeah.
Let's see that tape.
Taunting a bison.
No. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, God.
Police say that's Raymond Renke's beating his chest at the animal in Yellowstone National Park. He's had several run-ins, apparently, with the law at national parks over just the last few weeks.
Yeah, it got worse from there. Afterwards, he played that bison, Rosie's Selections from Bye Bye Birdie. It was horrible. You don't want to see that. Final question, another multiple choice question. A new Disney movie has been banned in China because President Xi is angry that people compare him to a character in the film. Who is the animated character? Is it A, Dumbo, B, Pinocchio, or C, Winnie the Pooh? Susan.
C, Winnie the Pooh.
Let's see.
Chinese movie fans will not be able to see the Winnie the Pooh movie, Christopher Robin. Chinese censors have banned the movie because people in the country were using Pooh memes to mock President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, President Trump would love it if the worst thing Rosie O'Donnell said about him was he's like Winnie the Pooh. Unfortunately, despite a plucky showing by our Canadian gal here, Geraldo has come through for the United States of America. Total humiliation. Final score, America 2, Canada 1.
So Canada. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
And that is it for this week's final exam. Pay attention to the news each week and tune in on Thursday nights to see if you can beat the professionals. We'll be right back.
Immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
That was the president 2 months ago. Now, today, Vice President Pence revealed the administration's more detailed plans for creating a fully independent Space Force in just 2 years. Professor Michio Kaku is a physicist, the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Future of Humanity. He joins us. Professor, if you watch TV, people seem to be making jokes about this thing, but most Western nations have essentially offshored huge parts of their infrastructure to the heavens in the last couple of decades, and yet they're essentially unguarded and totally vulnerable up there.
That's right. I think we have to take it seriously because Donald Trump sees this as part of his legacy. Long after he's gone, we're going to have a U.S. Space Force for the first time since 1947, a new branch of the military. And I think he wants to put his stamp of approval on this, so we have to take it seriously.
Yeah, but the joke about it is like it's a Plan 9 from outer space thing. These are like going to be Trump space cadets and everything. But we are vulnerable to much weaker countries who, if they happen to detonate something in the right spot over the middle of the country, would knock us back to the mid-19th century. That's what's at stake here.
That's right. We don't realize that outer space, we are a sitting duck for a preemptive strike.
Right.
You realize that we are the most vulnerable because we have over half of all the commercial operating satellites in orbit.
Yeah.
And even a small nation like North Korea, a hydrogen bomb over Kansas would be enough to wipe out nearly half of our telecommunications network and paralyze power stations across North America.
Right.
And that's just one hydrogen bomb over Kansas.
Yeah, and it's a situation that's never really existed. I mean, because it's happened so sort of imperceptibly, we don't realize that our banking system